is a quorum. So
Wonderful.
thank you all.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody to a meeting of the Subcommittee on Stop Data Analysis. We have a pretty straightforward agenda today. We have a couple of action items at the beginning, and then we're going to hear an overview from the Department of Justice about data for the upcoming annual report for this year, and then we'll have a conversation about priorities, and of course we'll take public comments. So the first point on our agenda is to approve the November 10th, 2021 meeting minutes. And so I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Move we approve. This is Board Member Kajabi, that we approve the minutes.
Okay. And is there a second?
Lonnie Taylor, I'll second the motion.
Okay. Maybe we can just go by a voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 And I'm an aye as well. I managed to skip the first bit of the agenda, which are introductions. So why don't we go back to point one, since we now have 5 board members on. So I'll kick it over to Chief Pridgen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abdul Pridgen, and I am the Chief of the San Leandro Police Department, and I'm representing the California Police Chiefs Association as the past president. And I'm just excited to be a member of the board and looking forward to contributing in any way I can to ultimately produce a product that improves relationships between police and communities of color and reduces disparities.
Public Defender Taylor, I hope I got your title correct.
Yes. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tamani Taylor. I'm the Chief Deputy Public Defender in Solano County, one of 2, and I'm appointed by the California Public Defenders Association, and very excited to be a member of the RIPA board as well as be on this subcommittee. Because based on the nature of what I do, this is a very important subject matter. So I hope to contribute in my way and the way of our organization, association, to better relations with the police and bridging better relations between the police and the community, and reducing racial profiling that goes on. And kind of the racial disparity that we see all the time in the criminal justice system. And I feel like this is an important an important starting point.
Thank you. And I might add that Chief Pridgen and Public Defender Taylor are new to I think this is your first Stop Data Subcommittee, so welcome. I see Lawanda Hawken. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I'm here in Southern California, and I apologize for being late. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And again, I apologize for being late.
Andrea Guerrero.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director at Alliance San Diego Community Organization, appointee of Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins. A pleasure to meet Ms. Taylor and Mr. Pridgen.
Wonderful. And Professor Kajabi, I don't see you on the screen, but I know you're here.
Here, well, I guess I could see myself. That's about as good as it gets today. Thank you. I'm Lily Kajabi. I'm a professor in mathematics at Loyola Marymount University, so that's in Southern California. And I want to also share an extra welcome to our 2 new board members, Board Member Taylor, Board Member Pridgen. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everybody. And my name is Stephen Raphael. I'm a professor of public policy at UC Berkeley and a gubernatorial appointee to the board. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is each subcommittee usually has two co-chairs, and we only have one. So we have a process right now where we can nominate subcommittee co-chairs, and then ultimately we'll have a vote. And I guess since I have the floor, I'd like to take the opportunity to nominate Board Member Kajabi to serve as co-chair if she's willing.
Thank you, Board Member Raphael. I would accept the nomination, although of course I welcome other nominations, other nominees as well. But I would be willing to serve if that's the will of the subcommittee.
I second that nomination.
Are there any other nominations for the chair?
I third that nomination.
Okay. So you realize you're going to have two professors who are known for being absent-minded, but I think she's less absent-minded than me, so we'll see. Okay, well, let's. Why don't we do a roll call vote then? So I'll start with Board Member Guerrero.
Yes.
Board Member Taylor.
Yes.
Board Member Pridgeon.
Yes.
Board Member Hawkins.
Yes.
And I'm a enthusiastic yes. And Board Member Kajabi.
I'm not sure if I'm not used to voting for myself, but I don't want, if I abstain, I don't want you to think I'm not willing to do it. So I'll vote yes too. Why not?
Okay, well, wonderful. It's unanimous. So welcome aboard, and I'm very happy that we'll be co-chairing this together. So it's great news. Okay, so let's move on now. We have an overview from the Department of Justice, and then we'll have that'll be followed up with the discussion regarding our stop data analysis chapter for the next report.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Raphael. So I'm Kevin from the Department of Justice Research Center. Today's overview from the DOJ will encompass two primary topic areas. The first will be familiar to anyone who attended the State and Local Policies Subcommittee meeting a couple weeks back. There was a discovery of a field, the Reason for Stop Reasonable Suspicion Offense Code field, was missing some information due to an ETL defect that was discovered after the last board meeting of last year. And so myself, as well as Rodney Smith, the director of the Application Development Bureau within CJIS, will both provide somewhat of an updated explanation of what an ETL process is, how it was discovered, when it was fixed, and then I will go over what analyses were affected from last year's reports, as well as go over what those analyses looked like before and after that issue was fixed. And then the second part of the update will be a presentation about a data comparison project that we have been working on within the department, examining RIPA data for incidents where officers indicated discharging their firearms, and comparing that to alternative sources of information for similar data. And so it'll be a two-part presentation and update. So with that, we'll start with the update about the ETL defect and the effect on the report. So for that, I will first pass it over to Rodney Smith to go over what an ETL is and how it was discovered.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. This is Rodney Smith with the Department of Justice. I'm the Application Development Bureau Director. ETL stands for Extract, Transform, and Load. I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but the data is collected in a stopped-based format, but it's converted to a person-based format for reporting. So in that transformation from one format to another, we have code that was written to do that transformation, and it was noted by staff back in December of 2020 that there was an issue after we had reprocessed the data from CHP and Oakland PD for the 2018-2019 data collection. So there was data that was reprocessed because that data was found to have issues in it, and when we reprocessed that information, the ETL job was modified. And when it was modified, a mistake was introduced. And we have since put in place practices and procedures to ensure all changes are reviewed prior to being moved into production. And again, because it's not necessarily an application code per se, it didn't fall into our standardized application code publication standards. So because it's a external tool that we utilize to do this extract, transform, and load, we've now, because it does utilize some SQL coding and things of that nature, we've utilized our standard coding practices to employ code review and things of that nature, so this doesn't happen for future transforms. I hope that helps you guys understand the issue that was experienced and how we've rectified it. I'll give it back to Kevin.
Thanks, Rodney. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to screen share a short PowerPoint. Let's see here. Hopefully everyone can see that. I'm not going to put my video up or else I'll experience internet issues. But hopefully this is showing. I'm seeing a nod from Steve. Okay, great. So I'm going to go over quickly here, and I'll note that I explained this a little bit in more detail at the State and Local Policy Subcommittee, but we have multiple things to go over during this time today, so this may be a bit quicker. But if people are interested in seeing this presentation a little bit slower, the recording of the State and Local Policy Subcommittee meeting is on the RIPA Board's website, and this presentation was previously given there. The recording of that for this presentation occurs between 1 hour and 13 minutes into that video and 1 hour and 22 minutes into that video. And so I'll run through this presentation, but I do want to make time to go through the second one as well. And so the analyses that were impacted by this ETL defect that was discovered back in December were analyses that constituted examinations of the primary reason for stop, reasonable suspicion offense code. These were the only analyses that were affected by this ETL defect, and these were the only analyses that needed to be removed so that we did not include information that was based upon defected data in the board's report. There were two sections that referenced this field. The one section was called From Data to Policies, addressing the profiling of transgender people, and the other section was called Data-Driven Approaches to Disability Justice. So within that first section, there was one graphic that referenced this field, and I'm showing that here. That was the distribution of reasonable suspicion stops attributed by officers to suspicion of sex work related offenses related crimes by gender. And over here on the left, we have, maybe you can see my cursor, hopefully, but here we have the prefix distribution that would have been included in earlier drafts of your 2022 report. And here is the postfix distribution displayed on the right. As we can see, only two groups had a change of 0.1 and 0.3 percentage points changes in the distribution. So this did not change any overall takeaways. However, the raw percentages did shift slightly for two groups in this comparison. Moving to the second section that had references to the specific field, there were four graphics in this section. The first of which is the graphic that was most affected by this update, and that was the percent of all stops identified as community caretaking stops broken down by disability type. Again, here on this slide, we have the same information displayed pre and post the ETL fix, and here is what would have been on the left presented in previous drafts of the report from last year. And here on the right, we can see that there were some changes to the distribution, however, which includes a 10 percentage point increase in the proportion of stops of persons perceived to have a mental health condition that occurred during community caretaking contacts. So this is the largest change in raw terms of any of the comparisons that we made using this field last year. But as we can see here, still the main takeaway from these analyses was that persons perceived to have disabilities, especially those perceived to have a mental health condition, had a much larger proportion of their stops originate during a community caretaking interaction. And so that was true both pre and post the implementation of the ETL defect fix. And so the overall takeaway from these analyses is the same. However, the difference is larger now between the groups post the update. And so I'll quickly go through the last three here. This also affected slightly between less than 0.1 percentage points up to 1 percentage point. Search rates broken down by disability and community caretaking. A similar amount for discovery rates broken down the same way, less than 0.1 percentage point change up to 0.9 percentage points change. And then finally, use of force rates broken down by disability group and community caretaking stop, which changed by less than 0.1 percentage points up to 1.5 percentage point change. However, the main takeaways discussed in those sections remain the same. And so, discussions from the board within those sections that referenced analyses and the findings therein still in their meaning remain the same. However, the actual raw percentage differences did change, which is why at the point in time they had to be removed from the draft of the report until we could fix the values in the system and rerun the analyses, which occurred after the board had voted on the report, which is why these weren't included in that. But we wanted to provide that as an update to bring you all into the fold regarding those changes and the rationale for why they were not included in the final version, given the timing of when this issue was discovered, and also to let you see for yourselves how little those changed those analyses. So that is the first part of the update that I was here to provide. I do have a second topic area that we are here to present an update, a DOJ update on. And sorry, I'm pulling it up now. Let me get to my BlueJeans app, go back in. Hopefully you can see this now, which looks the same as the beginning slide of that other presentation, but it's the format. I assure you this is a different presentation. You're not stuck in a loop. So this is going to be a presentation about some comparisons that the Research Center performed on 2020 RIPA data for incidents where officers indicated discharging their firearms to alternative sources of information for cases where officers discharged their firearms. And so an overview here, did I move to the next slide? Oh, is it frozen? Okay, there we go. Presentation overview. I will be providing an overview of the comparisons that we performed and the results that we obtained for these comparisons, as well as discussing some agency outreach that we performed in response to what we found with these comparisons. And then I'll be joined by Aaron Choi, who is the program manager over the Cures and Client Services programs within CJIS division, to talk about some next steps that the department is taking in response to our findings here. So, to start the comparison overview. Here, Department of Justice Research Center, DOJRC, staff compared 2020 RIPA stop data records involving a discharge of a firearm to alternative data sources for similar information. So these are cases within the RIPA data, and I want to be clear about this up front. We're specifically talking about within the RIPA data stops where officers indicated under the data field actions taken by officer during stop that they discharged their firearm or used their firearm. And so those are the specific universe of stops that we're speaking about in the RIPA data. So we performed these comparisons on 2020 data. I'll also note that we also did these URSIS comparisons with 2019 data and obtained similar results, but we performed additional comparisons using 2020 data, and that's more current. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. But it was consistent when we also performed this on 2019 data with what we saw here. And so the first source of information that we compared these incidents to was URSIS data, which is a statewide database for use of force incidents where a party was either received serious bodily injury, was killed, or there was a discharge of a firearm. So it's a fairly narrowly constrained database and data collection effort, and specifically within the URSIS database, and URSIS is collected under Assembly Bill 71. But specifically, we're filtering down to incidents where the civilian received a discharge of a firearm within that database. And then the second source of data that we compared the RIPA shooting incidents to was an external data source of fatal encounters at fatalencounters.org. And I'll go over that a bit here in a few slides from now. And then lastly, we did some kind of unstructured internet searches for officer-involved shootings from agencies that were collecting data in 2020, and then compared some of those against the information that we saw in the RIPA data. So for each of these data sources, staff compared incident counts and dates between the data sources to see how well they aligned. And so the first comparison, as I mentioned, is the URSIT comparison of RIPA incidents involving the discharge of a firearm by an officer to similar incidents where that were reported in the URSIS database for the same agencies. Overall, the 2020 RIPA data contained 146 incidents where officers indicated discharging their firearms, whereas the 2020 URSIS data contained 155 incidents, which is more than in RIPA. And I'll show this information broken down by agency that was reporting data in 2020 on this next slide. And so here we have a bar chart that shows each agency, all 18 agencies that were collecting in 2020. The green bars represent the number of incidents in which officers within the RIPA data indicated that they discharged their firearms, whereas the gray bars indicate within the URSIS data set the number of incidents in which a civilian received a firearm discharge. And so as we can see here, out of the 18 agencies, there were 11 agencies that reported more incidents in URSIS than in RIPA. Meanwhile, and this is the thing that sticks out the most, I think, when you look at this chart, there were 4 agencies that reported more RIPA incidents than URSIS incidents. Specifically, what sticks out here are the RIPA bars for the California Highway Patrol and for the Los Angeles Police Department. Each of these agencies reported a much larger volume of RIPA, or much larger number of RIPA firearm discharges than any other agency did, and multiple times the number of URSIS incidents that they reported. If we were to drop these two agencies from the comparison, we would be left with 16 agencies that had a combined total of 31 incidents in which officers indicated discharging their firearm within the RIPA data. Meanwhile, those same agencies would have indicated 115 incidents in URSIS where officers discharged their firearms. And in this graphic, we also see 3 agencies that reported the same number of incidents across databases, being the LA Schools Police Department, the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and the San Francisco Police Department. As we'll see on this next slide, however, when we compare the RIPA incident dates to those incident dates in URSIS, these blue numbers on this chart represent the number of RIPA incidents reported by each of these agencies that do not match with any incident dates in URSIS, while the green bars here show that the number of incidents by agency that do match with an incident date in URSIS. And as we can see, there's a total of, out of the 146 incident dates in RIPA, only 13 across all of the agencies that match, and there's only one agency, the San Francisco Police Department, that had all of their RIPA reported incidents match on incident date with the incidents in URSIS. And so based on these findings, we wanted to conduct some comparisons to information that was not transmitted directly from agencies to the department, given that both of these data sources are the agency. And so we sought out external data for similar incidents. And so we looked to fatalencounters.org. Fatal Encounters utilizes paid researchers, public records requests, and crowdsourced data to obtain information about civilian encounters with law enforcement that result in the death of a civilian. I'll note that fatal encounters does include a lot of incidents that do not involve the discharge of a firearm by law enforcement. And so when we are filtering through these records, we were filtering out non-reportable incidents that were not comparable to what we were looking to compare to in RIPA, being incidents where officers discharged their firearm. There are incidents within fatal encounters such as car collisions that result in fatalities that would not be applicable to compare to RIPA data for this purpose. And so we're not looking at that. So after we filtered out those incidents, we found 78 reportable incidents for 2020 in fatal encounters. And the RIPA data contained 3 incidents that matched on incident date with the 78 incidents that we found in fatal encounters. Meanwhile, when we compared URSIS incidents to fatal encounters, we got a match on 68 different incident dates, kind of displaying that URSIS had a much higher rate of matching information based on when these incidents are reported as having occurred than did RIPA. Kind of speaking to the potential that URSIS was a more reliable data source for this information. And although RIPA contained 146 incidents total, whereas fatal encounters only included 78 relative to RIPA's 146, there were still half the agencies that reported data in 2020, so 9 agencies, where we found more shooting incidents reported in fatal encounters, the crowdsourced dataset, than in the 2020 RIPA data. And so a final piece of follow-up that we performed with comparing RIPA data to other sources of information on incidents where officers discharged their firearms was performing some unstructured internet searches for information or articles or press releases or body camera footage that's available of officer-involved shootings that occurred in 2020. Now, this was a time-intensive task to filter through these materials, and so we didn't do this for agencies that did not report any incidents in RIPA, because the 2 previous comparisons kind of showed that those incidents were missing in RIPA already, and we didn't really need any additional. But we also did not perform these for the California Highway Patrol or LAPD, given the large volume of records that they had reported in RIPA, indicating that officers had discharged their firearms. We weren't going to be able to, we didn't have the resources to try and look all of those up. And so our internet searches returned 45 incidents in 2020 that we could find. And I do want to say that is not the universe of information that is out there. We were limited on resources to conduct this, and so this is what we were able to find within a short window. But 45 incidents from RIPA reporting agencies in 2020 where officers discharged their firearm, whereas the data for these remaining 12 agencies that we looked up in RIPA contained 31 incidents. Only one agency's RIPA data incident dates matched with those of the incidents that we found online. Again, that agency was the San Francisco Police Department. The dates of the incidents that we found online did tend to match with the dates of incidents that we observed in our fatal encounters lookups, as well as with our lookups in URSIS. And so overall comparison findings across the 3 different lookups we performed, right? We found a total of 14 out of 146 incident dates from within the RIPA data that matched with these 3 data sources. And we also found that the data sources other than RIPA tended to align with each other more so than they did with the RIPA data. And so based on these findings, the Research Center worked with the Client Services Program within the CJIS division to perform some preliminary outreach to agencies from Wave 1 and Wave 2 in order to better understand why it was that information for shooting incidents that was reported in RIPA did not closely align with the number or the timing of when URSIS incidents were reported as having occurred. And and so in performing some outreach to these 15 agencies, we received responses from 9 of the agencies that we reached out to. 4 of these agencies within the comparisons reported more shootings in their RIPA data than they did under URSIS. Responses from these agencies indicated that they had determined that many of the RIPA shooting incidents contained within the data that we contacted them about contained data entry errors. And so an example of that an agency provided here of something that they observed in their data after we brought this to their attention was that officers from a given agency had performed field sobriety tests on individuals and then inadvertently had selected firearm discharged or used under the menu within their system where they are to enter in the actions that the officer took during the course of the stop, because that menu is organized alphabetically, and so field sobriety test comes right before firearm discharged, and so in these cases these officers accidentally selected the box below the one that they had intended to use. And so agencies tended to attribute these extra incidents where officers had indicated that they discharged their firearms where we are not finding those incidents elsewhere to data entry errors. For the other 5 agencies that provided responses, they had reported more incidents under URSIS than they did under RIPA, so kind of the opposite direction as far as the differences go. These agencies tended to attribute differences to 2 things that are related, right? At the core of it, it was the case that officers or detectives not entering data for stop incidents where an officer discharged their firearm, and upon some review, these agencies had determined some procedural shortcomings regarding who within the agency completes post-officer involved shooting documentation. So whereas on a normal stop, the officers involved in the stop, or the primary officer, would fill out all of the documentation and paperwork related to that stop, including RIPA, the entry of RIPA data. After an officer-involved shooting, oftentimes there is a separate group within the department, sometimes a homicide unit, right, that will come in and perform the investigation and complete the documentation surrounding that stop incident. However, based on responses, it appears that within some agencies they had not established protocols or procedures to ensure that even though the primary officers on these stops were not completing other documentation related to the stop, that someone ensured that RIPA data was still being entered after an officer-involved shooting when another group came in to complete the documentation for that stop. And so that was another major finding from outreach to agencies. So to kind of recap here about the comparisons and what we found here, right? So comparisons of firearm discharge incidents and RIPA data to alternative data sources of similar information revealed little overlap, which presents some data reliability and validity concerns, specifically for incidents within the RIPA data where officers indicated discharging their firearm. Upon outreach to agencies, this led many agencies to discover issues that were resulting in either the over and or under-reporting of incidents where officers discharged their firearms. During the outreach and the responses that we received from agencies in response to our questions in the outreach, a few agencies indicated that as this was brought to their attention, they had plans to institute some changes within their agency in order to address and alleviate this issue moving forward, such as including some system user interface changes so that selecting a firearm discharge was not placed so closely to or next to items that officers would oftentimes select. Changing homicide documentation procedures to include assurances that RIPA data are entered, instituting a review process for what's called high-risk incidents, such as officer-involved shootings, and instituting trainings to go over these new processes for review of these sorts of incidents to ensure that RIPA data is entered accurately, and changing current training and instituting potential policy changes as well aimed at informing officers of reporting requirements during these sorts of or after these sorts of incidents. And so that's an overview of some of the comparisons that we performed. our outreach efforts, what we learned from agencies, what those agencies responded as far as what some of their planned responses to this information were. And then I also am going to pass over the baton here to Aaron Choi, again, who's the program manager over the Cures and Client Services program within CJIS division at the Department of Justice, to talk a little bit about next steps from the department's perspective in response to these findings. And so with that, I will mute here and hand it over to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. As he said, my name is Aaron. I really appreciate this opportunity to be with the subcommittee and members of the public this afternoon. Kevin, I'm going to just quickly steal the screen from you, if that's okay. Thank you. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. What I've prepared is just kind of a short response to let you know that DOJ is going to be taking multiple components into consideration as we move forward. So as noted there on the screen, those include outreach, training, looking at potential regulatory changes that could help address this situation, and then also potential system or technical enhancements. So I'd like to spend just a few minutes walking through each of those. Regarding outreach, Kevin detailed some of the feedback that we received from agencies, and that was very helpful, but our outreach with them will continue. I'd say that was kind of some initial feedback. Within my section, we were already planning follow-up sessions with the 500 plus agencies that just began collecting RIPA data as of January of this year, and I expect that we're going to have those meetings scheduled in the coming weeks, and those sessions will include this analysis and findings from the research center. Another tool that we use to get information out to the field is something that's called an information bulletin. That's communication that DOJ can send out to the head of each of the reporting agencies and provide guidance or information about different reporting requirements. So we have a draft information bulletin on this topic that's currently under review. So hopefully that will just kind of give you a little bit of a picture of some of what our ongoing work is going to be with the agencies. But then another really important component is always training. So I know we have some newer members of the subcommittee on here, so let me just tell you a little bit about what DOJ has been doing on that front. As the waves of different agencies started to be required to report RIPA data, DOJ has been hosting a series of trainings to go over with them the reporting requirements. Kind of at the peak of things last year with so many agencies getting ready to collect the data, we were actually having those trainings bi-weekly. And there's something that are kind of co-taught by staff in my area, along with staff from the Civil Rights Enforcement section. So now that we have these findings from the Research Center, we'll be looking into ways that we could update that course to really highlight these important scenarios that should also be getting reported for RIPA. And then, as an extension from that class, of course, we have training materials, quick reference guides, frequently asked questions, those types of things. So we'll be incorporating this information into those related training materials. And then the third component is relative to the reporting requirements themselves. So I'm going to take a pause from PowerPoint for just a minute, but I wanted to kind of pivot and talk about how the data gets reported. Individual screens that officers may be using to enter the data may work differently. There's over 20 different vendors that have products out there for agencies. Excuse me, but there's kind of a general template, and I'll put a link to this in the chat if folks want to take a closer look at it. But one of the required sections is about actions taken. And as Kevin said, some of the feedback was just indicating that people were mistakenly clicking on the wrong thing. In the current reporting requirements from the regulations, there's 24 different items. So it's quite a long list of things that people could select from. And in the latest version of proposed regulatory changes that came out in January for public comment, one of the proposed amendments is to break up this big field into separate categories. So if those regulations go forward and are finalized, instead of having this longer list about a whole variety of actions taken, the proposal is to break it up into a category of specific items that are force related and then non-force related. So let me just kind of show you a quick peek at those, and I'll add this link into the chat as well, where folks can see kind of a marked up version of the regulations. But specifically here, would be non-force related items, and then a whole separate category for just the force items. So hopefully that would make it a little bit more kind of forward for people to distinguish between the two. And then last but not least, we'll also be looking at potential system enhancements. As Kevin said, that could be everything just from spacing out checkboxes of what folks see on the screen, to even possibly looking at things like having some additional instructions or informational messages get generated depending on the type of data that's being reported. I know we moved through some of those items quickly, but I just can't stress enough that we want to make sure that kind of the response to this is comprehensive, and we've identified these different components to really start moving things forward on. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Kevin, or if there's any questions or if anything else would be helpful for us to share right now.
Thanks, Aaron. And so with that, I don't have any more materials to present at this time, but there is the next agenda item, which is for, of course, subcommittee discussion, which can include discussion of any of the information that was just shared, questions, as well as hopefully discussion aimed at identifying topic areas that this subcommittee would like to plan towards creating report content in their 2023 report. Centering around STOP data analysis. And just for, I know that a few of the subcommittee members here were in the other subcommittee meetings that have occurred already, and specifically, I'm talking mostly about the State and Local Policy Subcommittee, which did include some conversations surrounding some ideas for data analysis to be included in that section. And I know that last year there was some collaboration across that subcommittee for data analysis and this subcommittee. So that, to kind of paraphrase the discussion of that subcommittee, they kind of identified a continuation of this examination of the idea of pretextual stops by examining the RIPA data, as well as they floated a couple ideas for either examinations of stops by school resource officers or stops on K-12 campuses. And then there was some discussion about whether that might be something that they'd like to push to the next year's report, and instead this year focus on stops of youth to allow for another year for more data collection on more stops that occurred on K-12 campuses. And so they didn't reach a determination. They didn't vote on those things. However, those were kind of the main discussion items from that meeting, from that subcommittee, surrounding ideas for potential stop data analysis to be included in those sections. And I know that there was some collaboration last year, and so I wanted to briefly touch on that and summarize it for board members that were not in attendance of those meetings to kind of preface the discussion in case you'd like to also consider some of those items as well. So with that, an opportunity here for if there are other DLJ staff that have items to add beyond what we've discussed here today, this might be a good time to chime in, but otherwise I will be here for the board's discussion.
Okay, thank you, Kevin and Aaron and Rodney for that update. Why don't do we want to discuss the contents of that presentation? Do any board members have suggestions or comments?
If I may, that was helpful, concerning that that the integrity of the data is, that we still have some ways to go to make sure that the data that we're collecting reflects what's actually happening. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness on what the data says, what this experiment or this research tells us, the outreach conversations that you had, suggestions around regulatory changes. All of that is very helpful. I think this is just something that we need to keep a very close eye on. And it makes me think about what the RIPA board could do in terms of providing some model language around officer-involved incident reporting, if that doesn't already exist in DOJ practice guides. I'm not sure what you're planning to put out in your information bulletin, but I thank you for the information. I think it's something we need to keep a very close eye on.
Thank you, Board Member Guerrero. I have a couple of comments about several of these items. First of all, I think it's going to help a lot when the use of force elements and the actions are separated. So my guess will be that the actions will be consulted regularly and routinely, and use of force will be, that field will be used less frequently, and perhaps rather than quickly checking something when they do visit that field, it might focus the attention of the person filling out the form. And I wonder, I don't know if this is possible post-regulatory review, but I wonder if it's possible to organize the list of the use of force items so that it follows the, a use of force continuum from least lethal to most lethal, perhaps ordered in that way. And then maybe that might increase accuracy. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true. Perhaps it's worth consulting a survey design expert about that, and maybe even, trying to understand the way officers are trained regarding the perceived continuum. But I think some design of the data collection instrument redesign that's proposed will be good. And if there's room to maybe make a couple other tweaks to, make sure that the most severe are sort of somehow flagged either in some kind of order. Because sometimes, alphabetical isn't necessarily the best way if there's already a preconceived sense of some kind of ordering along some dimension. I guess the other thing I was wondering just a little bit about is we have some instances where there's a discharge of firearm that are captured in RIPA and not in the URSIS, and then vice versa. And I don't know if those are all, if those particular where they're in RIPA but not URSIS, if those are all mistakes, or if some of those are real and they're not in URSIS. But a lot of times researchers use, they borrow a tool from, it's like ecological studies, where they do kind of a capture-recapture analysis, where if you have one count and another count and they don't overlap entirely, you can use those to triage an estimate of how frequently something occurs. It sounds like, at least for shootings, I don't know how reliable the data we've collected to date is, given its proximity to something that is done more frequently. But that's just another thing to keep in mind. And then I guess the final thing, maybe just a question about the ETL. So was the problem that the stops were, I guess when it was being transferred from stop level data to person level data, that somehow it wasn't counting all the persons in the stop? Or was there a field that was coded in a way that the reason for the stop was systematically not using one error? And I think it looks like, I'm glad that you guys caught it, and I think it's great. If there's a mistake, you have to just address it, right? And that's the way the data over the years will become more reliable. But maybe just a little bit more, sounds like you nailed what it is.
I could take a stab at giving you my understanding of the ETL defect and specifically how that affected the records. However, I do want to offer an opportunity for Rodney to chime in, given that the ETL is handled by his group, and he'd probably have a more in-depth understanding of the exact nature of the change. But if he dropped off.
No, I'm here, Kevin. I mean, the exact nature of the change, what happened is a staff member deleted a line out of the transform code, didn't notice it. And again, as I mentioned, we put things in place to ensure that those kinds of human errors don't happen again. We're putting a second set of eyes, getting things reviewed, and then promoting that code from the initial lower levels to the upper levels. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Would any other board members wish to comment on the presentation, or Board Member Kajabi?
Just say something. I really appreciated his presentations, and especially that this data comparison was taken on around firearm discharge. It was extremely troubling. It's extremely troubling to see that, especially the underreporting. We all know when there's a data collection effort with hundreds of thousands of elements of data and beyond being collected, there can be errors, but this is a small subset when firearms are discharged, and if we're completely miscapturing it, that's very, very serious. And so I really appreciate the comparison was done, and maybe it goes without saying that not only the steps were suggested, but maybe there can be follow-up through RIPA, or in particular through the work that DOJ is doing to make sure down the road that those changes are implemented so that the data collection is improved. Because it's really critical that there's transparency and integrity to the data, and it's very troubling to hear when there are errors of this scope. So thank you. I appreciate the report very much.
Sorry, yeah, just to respond there a bit. This is definitely something that the Research Center is planning on when we gain access and when the data closeout period closes for the 2021 data on reproducing. Something along these lines that can be altered if there's input from board members, et cetera. But something that we're interested in tracking so that we know this in advance of when we're running through analyses that would reference these sorts of incidents, that we can be upfront with kind of the considerations that we have with the other data sources that we can compare this to. I'll note, though, that unfortunately, as far as timelines go for the closeout periods or data collection periods between RIPA and URSIS, or AB 953 and AB 71, RIPA data comes in or is required to be submitted to the department earlier in the year than URSIS data, and so there will be a period of time during which we have RIPA data, but there's not complete URSIS data, and so we won't be able to perform these sorts of comparisons to those internal data sources until after we have both data sources, so that'll likely occur in July. But just to give people an idea of what sort of timeline to anticipate for us to begin re-examining this with the 2021 data so that we can report back on that.
I have a question. San Francisco was the only agency that had a 100% accurate reporting. Was there something about their system that made it so accurate? I mean, I would have assumed that there'd be some sort of, confirmatory or review process to make sure that those kind of errors didn't occur, since the data is so important. But clearly that's not happening in agencies. And I think as you're adding agencies, the potential for those errors to occur is going to get greater, exponentially greater. And then to be able to have to go back and do those types of checks is going to require more and more resources and more time. And as you said, the timelines aren't the same, don't correlate for when information has to be reported. So are you guys looking at San Francisco and just in an effort to say, hey, in the outreach efforts and the training efforts to say, maybe this is what works and this should be your process? I guess that might be a better question for Erin. I'm not sure since she's been doing the outreach.
Yes, yes to everything you just said. This is Erin. Yes. When we have gotten agencies together before, sorry, I'm getting a little shadow on my face right now. When we have gotten agencies together before, it's one thing for DOJ to give advice, but hearing from their colleagues is often powerful too. So hearing from another agency about what they have implemented that seems to be working can be helpful. That's how we've kind of approached these lessons learned sessions in the past. Not only sharing what DOJ has found, but then also giving agencies the opportunity to share with one another. So yes, it's definitely something that we'll be exploring more with SFPD and the larger community of agencies too.
Something to add as far as an additional item that for time savings I wasn't able to cover during the presentation. However, it was part of the outreach that we conducted where we were asking whether agencies for these sorts of critical incidents such as officer-involved shootings, if there was any additional level of review after the point when officers were entering the data for these. Like if an officer selected that they discharge their firearm, does that flag a record within an agency that it needs to undergo an additional level of review to confirm the factual accuracy of that stop data entry? And for the agencies that responded to our questions there were no agencies that at that point had instituted a second form of review that was specific to certain triggers within the data. Or options that officers selected. And so that may also be another area where agencies may wish to institute some sort of secondary or tertiary levels of review for incidents that contain entries for things like officer-involved shootings. So that's something that we learned as well through the outreach to the agencies. So hopefully that provides a little bit of additional context as well.
Just, I like that's a great idea of comparing agencies that are getting it right and agencies where there are mistakes. I think that's it. I wonder, in some agencies that I've worked with, any discharge of a firearm, I think, opens up a use of force report. At least, I don't know if that's universal across agencies, and I wonder maybe if there's a way to advise if a use of force report is opened up. And they are, much smaller in numbers than stops, that there's a cross-check back to the RIPA entry that it's correct. It might be another way to build in some cross-validation. And then another question I think that comes up just about general data quality is, now that more agencies are coming on and they're going to be smaller agencies that maybe don't have the resources to have a data analyst or what have you, that the guidance probably from DOJ and what they can learn from their colleagues that have been doing it for a few years is going to be increasingly more important. So I don't know, perhaps do we want to move on to, or do we want to make, I think it's wonderful that you guys are cross-checking to other sources. And I think that's to the extent that we could do that for other fields, that's if there's secondary sources against which to check for consistency. These issues have come up in the past, in past board meetings, so I think that's a good thing. Do we want to maybe think about incorporating into the data analysis subsection some discussion of validation and data quality and improvement procedures and practices for trying to find problems and address them? Or why don't we just open the floor up for anything else that anyone thinks we should be discussing this year beyond what we normally do in the data analysis section?
This is Board Member LaWanda. When Kevin brought up the youth and at the schools, I think we do need to look at that, because there is some type of conflict going on I know a LA Unified School District with law enforcement. So yeah, we do need to look to see how many youth are being stopped and what are they being stopped for.
I agree with LaWanda. I was very surprised in reading the report at the treatment of like 9 to 14-year-olds, that they're handcuffed and, at these high rates. And I was wondering, when reading that, well, what is the race data on those children? Because I could probably, I can guess, and I'd probably be right. And so I do think that, I don't know if that was part of the discussion about juveniles, is not only, incorporating juveniles, but incorporating race and gender data regarding juveniles, because I think that's an important factor for the committee, for the subcommittee.
Yes, and that would dovetail with what the policy subcommittee wanted to focus on, which was youth broadly, not limited to the school data, in part because the school districts are just coming online with their reporting, but getting a broader look at the data for youth, and then looking at that with the lens of all of the racial identity data points like we've done with other groups. I think making this the year that we focus on that deeper look at data on youth is a really great idea.
Because that's their first encounter with law enforcement, and it depends on how it turns out. And we need to know what's happening, because I hear a lot of youth are saying they've been stopped just riding a bicycle.
And I just this is kind of separate from the juvenile. It was an idea I had and I'm just throwing it out there, because I thought it would be interesting. I think at one point in the report, it did a little bit of this, but I would like to see, and it's not necessarily analyzing data as far as numbers, actual numbers coming in, but it would almost be taking the information that we have, layering it, and kind of coming with a risk score, which would be a police officer risk score, meaning the danger the officer has against a person, right? Because one of the things that came up in the report was this friction, this ability to understand that you're dealing with officers dealing with a person, and that they might have an implicit bias. And I thought that, for example, if an officer's approaching a person and they understand that it's an African American transgender female with a mental illness, there could be some kind of analysis to say that person creates for the officer a risk factor score of 5, because that takes what the officer is subjectively doing, and it takes them and makes them objectively evaluate their behavior and say, if this person's at a 5, these are the things I have to start doing to myself when I'm approaching this person, so that I make sure I am in the best possible position to approach this person. I don't know if that makes sense. And I was wondering if that was something that would be appropriate for stop data, because you would basically be taking the data we already have and kind of saying officers create this kind of a threat to a human being who, as you add these factors in, based on the information that we already have. And perhaps we could ultimately correlate that to maybe you go through this sort of practice when that happens, officer, so that you're objectively evaluating the situation versus subjectively evaluating the situation when you go into it.
Okay, do we have any further comments? I'm gonna just try to summarize some of, we'll get to a next steps section after we have public comment, but there seems to be clear indication from the board that focusing on juveniles this time, as in addition to all of the things that are typically included in the annual report, I think more discussion of quality checks is useful. And then maybe thinking about ways that the RIPA data could be used to convey back situations that might be higher risk versus lower risk to correct misperceptions. For some reason, and I don't know if this is correct, but I thought that maybe the state of New Jersey had instituted a kind of at the terminal assessment for the purposes of whether there would be, a booking versus citation in the field. So there might be, something that we can investigate there in terms of research out in other states that other jurisdictions have experimented with. So are there other comments? Board Member Kajabi?
Thanks. Just a couple of comments. Looking back at last year's report, and I really appreciate all the ideas that were just shared. Last year, we went to the point of making some really what I would call strong recommendations, and so not just presentation of the data, but what is that telling us, and what recommendations can we make? For example, concerning the use of consent and searches and disparities in policing. So one of the things I've been thinking about is I would like to know how we could keep track maybe of the progression of those recommendations, whether it's in the legislature and agencies and so on. So I'd like us to have that in the back, or maybe in the forefront of our minds this year. As recommendations are made, can we keep track of their progression somehow? And then maybe more narrowly, last year we've been thinking about data analysis relative to type of violation, for example, moving and non-moving violations. And in the past, Chair Raphael and other board members have suggested, for example, we look at the most frequent types of violations when we see, I should say, pronounced racial and ethnic disparities in the data and it points again to concrete changes or recommendations that can be made very explicit but are related to the type of violation. And it seems to me that last year we sort of took a first stab at that, but there may be more to glean from that. So we looked at maybe the 5 most common moving violations and the 5 most frequent non-moving violations. So the LAPD has announced ending pretextual stops on the non-moving violation side, and it could be valuable to see how that's proceeding. Is that change really happening, or are there particular violations or technical violations that ultimately maybe they don't belong so much in policing? It matters for other agencies. So these ideas have been suggested in the past board discussion. And I think they're worth pursuing further. So looking at type of violation. And then looking ahead, as more agencies are coming online, in particular smaller agencies, it's going to be great to get a window into those. We already have some very large, for example, CHP and some of the other larger agencies. We want to make sure that doesn't obscure what's happening in smaller agencies, just the sheer volume of data. And I remember Board Member Hawkins and also Board Member Walker in the past have raised this as an issue that we want to look at or get a sense of what's happening in neighborhoods or what's happening in smaller geographic areas. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, especially as we start to see data from smaller agencies. And so those are just some comments that I wanted to share as a precursor to thinking about our next steps. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no further comment,
Steve, I think you're muted again. Sorry, Steve, thanks.
All right, that's the absent-minded professor part. So if there's no further comments, I guess we'll move on to the public comment period. So I'll try my best to identify people who'd like to speak, but why don't we start in Southern California? And I think you can raise your hand. So just to let everyone know, we're listening to your public comments. The board members usually don't respond, but we value the public participation, and we know that we have several members of the public that frequently participate, and we want to hear what you have to say. So why don't we start in Southern California? Anyone in Southern California? Okay, how about Northern California? Oh, wait. Oh, how about Northern California? Mr. Shriver? I hope I said your name right. Okay. How about Northern California?
Anyway, I think I see a raised hand. Is it Anand?
Oh, I see. Anand. Okay, Anand, if you could unmute yourself.
Sure. Hi, thank you. I just wanted to briefly comment on the data integrity issue. I had a little experience with this in our own tiny town here, where our local sheriff was collecting RIPA data, although they were not yet, I guess we are in the next wave to be submitting it. So I got it via public records request. And I was comparing it with their police blotter data, which I guess comes from their the 9/11 people, or what do they call it, the control center or whatever, which is maintained separately, and found that there were all sorts of issues with the data. Nothing seemed to match. So I think what might be a good idea for you guys is to go back to the agency and find another source of the same data, like the call center or whoever else is also maintaining the exact same data and is being called in by the cops as they're making the stop, and use that as a point of comparison to see what integrity issues you have. I imagine if you're finding these issues with force incidents, there are a lot more issues with everything else. Thank you.
Are you entertaining the speakers? Thank you, Anand.
Sorry, I'm muted again. Sorry about that. Yeah, is there anybody else who would like to make public comment? Okay, seeing none, I guess we'll move to our discussion of next steps. So just to summarize, I think we did identify those stops of juveniles, quality checks. I think there was a good idea there in public comment to perhaps look at CAD data or other sources of stops that we might be able to cross-check and see the degree of consistency. Looking at smaller departments and some regional variation suggested by Board Member Kajabi. And then also follow up on legislative suggestions, policy suggestions from last year. And I as well, I think that, or the other suggestion was to look for stops that appear to be high frequency, low stakes, relatively less serious, where maybe we can think of fixes that perhaps might involve some sort of effort on the part of the Department of Motor Vehicles, or just as an example, or some other way that we may be able to obviate the need for frequent interactions. I think those are all good suggestions. Kevin, if you're still on, or perhaps let's open it up now as well to the board members if there are other future action steps that you'd like to highlight that I didn't just summarize from our meeting.
That seems like an affirmation of the summary that was just made.
Okay, Nancy, did you want to speak?
I did raise my hand, yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to address Lily's request for the small data. We won't actually have that until maybe, I think probably about 12, 13 months from now. So the smaller agencies did start collecting this year, but we won't get that till April 1st of next year. So I just wanted to point that out, but we can certainly maybe take a look at laying the groundwork for that this year. And then I also wanted to address the issue about the pretext stops. We did begin that work last year as well, and I believe Kendall is going to follow up and work on that, I think, for the policy subcommittee. So that work will be continued on in that fashion. Allison, is there anything else? I don't know if you're available. I don't know if there's anything else that I'm forgetting about some of the other subcommittee work, but if you can't come on.
No, I think that was a good summary, and I am, I think it might be helpful, Kevin, if you talk a little bit about how, the capability to do, since we do have a few minutes now, the capability of doing some of these analyses and thinking about how we might be able to do them. It does sound like there's an interest from multiple board members on youth, and so we can certainly think about doing a deep dive on that. I'd be interested, we have discussed in the past, this is to Board Member Taylor's suggestion, we've discussed in the past, thinking about, okay, if from, I know you were talking about it a little bit from an officer perspective, but also thinking about it from a community perspective of, if I am a Black youth, what am I likely to experience? And so maybe we can think about how to do that kind of analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I think to speak to, one of the first items you were talking about feasibility of attacking these issues. I think that in some of the other subcommittee meetings where I wasn't leading the beginning of the discussion, there's been some discussions earlier on in the meeting talking about a general desire this year to create a more succinct report rather than a 300 some odd page report, and to have specific topic areas and focuses to each of the subcommittee's works. So for example, the policy subcommittee last year, I think, had upwards of 6 different focus areas, which for as far as the staffing perspective goes, made it very difficult to flesh out all of the sections, which is kind of why we're continuing on some of those things this year across reporting years, which isn't, there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? But an idea to kind of focus in this year's reports on specific subtopics so that we can flesh out those sections and analyses that are included there. And so just looking at kind of the volume of different topics that have been suggested as ideas here, I do think that there will likely need to be some focusing by the subcommittee or the full board on what the main priorities are for this year's report, and with an acknowledgement that these are all excellent ideas that are worthy of exploration, but may need to occur across multiple reporting periods, just given resourcing that we can dedicate to each individual item there. I'm also picking up a little bit of background noise. Yes, and so I think that might need to be a discussion that either the subcommittee has at some point in determining which of the ideas here that have been expressed today they want to be the focus of this year's report. I know that other sections, I don't want to limit it right, or place a number on it, but I think that there should be a prioritization. That way DOJ staff know exactly where the priorities lie as far as which, if we're only able to accomplish a certain number of fully fleshed out sections in this year's stop data analysis portion of the report, which ones the subcommittee members are most interested in having in the 2023 report. Yes. I'm trying to think if I wanted to add. No, I think that's where I think that was my input there.
Okay, well, I wonder, should we prioritize? Should we perhaps offer priorities to the things we suggested? So I think both subcommittees have suggested a focus on juvenile stops. So I think that's an obvious one. The risk assessment, or the kind of the likelihood that a stop might have a severe outcome. Maybe doing a little feasibility research, and we can at least try to understand how plausible that is, and whether that's done in other areas. That might be more technical, more complicated, more multi-year, but certainly worthy. I think quality control is something that we, it just has to be part of this process forever, right? And there's always going to be issues that can be improved, and it's good to have the cross-checking. I don't know how much that has to be in a report, but maybe some reporting out of the efforts that you're taking, very similar to what you gave us today, just so it's recorded, and the efforts and the findings and the fixes are noted for years to come. I think that would be useful. Do any board members have any suggestions regarding prioritizing?
Well, I also wonder, as a companion, I know we really want to narrow down, and I like this idea of a narrowly targeted, really effective subcommittee report from all the subcommittees. I do wonder that looking back at last year's a very comprehensive, it was literally a weighty report, but there may have been some analysis that was done there that we really do want to continue at a minimum for a couple of years to see where things are headed. Kevin, were you proposing prioritizing some of those along with the new research area as you were describing this idea of the subcommittee reports?
Right. What I was talking about specifically when I was speaking just now was more so the ideas that have been proposed here today. But are you talking about some of the other areas that were, say, in the policy subcommittee section last year, and a desire to kind of replicate those again as a way of tracking some of those analyses across years? Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. Doing something like that from the perspective of replicating previous analyses is something that's easier to do than to start with things from the ground up. I do just want to, again, in keeping with some of the discussions with other subcommittees before, keep in mind the kind of real estate within the report that we're dedicating to past analyses and what we're dedicating to the focused analyses of a specific any one year. The one thing that I do hope to avoid is, kind of a report each year that contains all of previous year's analyses on top of the new ones, which will then kind of spread our staff resources thin as far as executing those analyses, writing them up, reviewing them, presenting them, et cetera. And so, if there are priority items from within that section that were, and again, those were used to kind of reinforce some of the board's previous recommendations from last year. And so I completely understand a desire to continue on by providing updated information on those. But again, if there are specific ones that board members are most interested in potentially replicating, that would be good information for us to have as we're going into the kind of the data analysis period of the year.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from DOJ, what you think would be a good set of priorities given your bird's eye view across what's been expressed in the other committees, and what you think the data is pointing to, the opportunities for analysis, the capacity that you have.
Yeah, so I do want to open this up a little bit to CREST, because I know that they worked on a lot of the policy recommendations, and I think what might inform what things are the most worthwhile to replicate across years are the ones that we could continue to strengthen those policy recommendations. And I know that they worked on a lot of the background research and recommendations there, but to speak a little bit to give it, some insight into resourcing, and this is current and subject to change, but as far as Research Center, we're actually currently down 2 positions dedicated to running analyses and supporting this board. We're currently trying to hire for those, but we are down to a staff of myself and 2 other analysts, which we are down on from what we're supposed to have. So hopefully we'll get qualified applicants here moving forward and get some hired on so that we can increase our capabilities and continue with the level of service that we've been able to provide in years past. But just since there was the question about that is where some of my concerns stem from when I see a longer list of proposed section content. And so I just did want to provide that. But again, we are hiring. We're hoping to have more people on in the coming months. But I don't know if CREST has any ideas surrounding what areas specifically there were analyses in for the policy sections that if we were to continue with some of those analyses, what would help reinforce the board's position from previous years more. And if there isn't comments there, then sorry, sorry for kicking it over, but I do want to ensure that I allow for y'all to share some perspective as well.
Thanks, Kevin. I think Steve was spot on about the desire to look at youth and schools in particular. And I think those, having the STOP data subcommittee look at the data pieces and the policy subcommittee kind of help develop some of the policies from the data would be a nice integration of the work. We haven't really fully, I don't think we've really dealt with the schools or the youth issue. So those are 2 contexts that we could look at youth as a whole and then schools as well. We do have the Open Justice, dashboard on schools. And I just, from the data that we had, I took a look at it and I was shocked. So I would really like to take a look at that and really evaluate that instead of having my superficial view. And I think also, like we were talking about, we could, I can't remember, Lily, if it was you or Tamani that mentioned looking at the violations that may be indicating pretextual stops. And building upon, what the board started last year, and then really drilling down and looking at different types of the stops, and then, what are the outcomes of those stops? If we can figure that out from the stop data, we may not know if the person was charged, or those kinds of things, but what happened in those interactions for the data that we have. I'm sure Allison has some other thoughts as well. So, Allison.
No, I think you said it well, Nancy. And I think if we do, with the 2 subcommittees, focus on, continuing the pretext, and, there might be some, some quicker analyses that we may do just to see if the consent or supervision numbers you know, are similar to what they were last year, without delving into it as a full topic, but just kind of a follow-up. But I think, you know, both, I know multiple subcommittees last year and the board as a whole expressed interest in the pretext issue. And so I think both looking at the data and looking at the research around that, and obviously LA has taken a big step there, so we might be able to tell differences in data. You know, that probably won't be until next year as a follow-up to pretext, but at least seeing if other agencies follow suit and, you know, taking a look at what else is out there about pretext, because I know we just sort of touched on that because we were, the board was, you know, focused on consent, supervision, and pretext. And so if we focus in on pretext this year, you know, we can go deeper on that and then go deeper with youth, both, you know, you know, and it might be an interesting touch point to see how many of the stops of youth take place in schools. Like that might tell us a lot about, you know, where youth are being stopped and what's happening there. And so there is kind of a nice intersection between, or, you know, overlap in those areas. And so we might be able to start looking at those this year, and that may be an ongoing and continuing project for future years for the board. And obviously it's a really critical topic for a lot of people, and one that does get some attention, but with the RIPA data, it might be able to, we might be able to home in on some of the particular data areas. And I think to Board Member Taylor's point, you know, it's something we have been thinking about creatively, and so we can continue to do so, I think, in terms of if I am this, you know, identity in this race, what might my experience be? And so we might be able to think about how to highlight some of that. You know, I think that goes along with the board's interest in continuing to put a human face to the data and think about that. And so I think if there are creative ways we can do that, you know, we might be able to focus in on that. But I think, you know, given bandwidth and limited resources, you know, I think we can continue to think about doing that and maybe talk to the research center about, and maybe we can even pick, you know, some of the intersectional identities that seem to be, have the most disparities and just highlight one or two also as a starting point. You know, that might be something, looking at the intersectionality could be important, and maybe it's youth also. And so I think as you know, I think we have a good starting point for doing some of the research and background research, you know, before the data will get finalized to DOJ by April 1. So the next, if we have a subcommittee meeting in the summer, we can start looking at some of the research for these areas and present you all with what we're finding, and then look at how that maps out to the data once that can be analyzed.
That sounds like a plan. Okay, are there any other further comments from board members for DOJ? Well, not hearing any. I think the next item on our agenda is to adjourn. So I just wanted to thank everybody and thank the Department of Justice for giving us the overview and for your continual work and effort on this project, and to my fellow board members and my new co-chair. Very happy, Lily, to that we're going to do this together. And I think, do we need a vote to adjourn, or can we just adjourn?
You can just adjourn.
Okay. Right. And thank you to the public for attending, and we'll I guess we'll call this meeting to a close. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.